Hi, I'm Jordan, and I'm developing a 1v1 fantasy wargame for mobile and browsers called Manafields. The game's going to be asynchronous like online chess, and although it's similar in visual style to tactics games like Advanced Wars and Wargroove, the rules in Manafields are really a lot closer to more traditional tabletop war games like Warhammer and Kings of War. All of your units are going to begin the game on the board, and you'll take turns issuing commands to them, moving them across the field to claim objectives and to clash head-on with enemy units. I've already made some pretty significant progress on the game. This document here contains all the rules for Manafields, and everything in green has already been implemented. In this video, I want to take you through the first few weeks of development so you can see how the project's taking shape. And if you want to know more about the game in general, check out my last video where I gave a more high-level overview of Manafields. In the first week, I needed some placeholder art assets that I could use during development. So I went to the Kenny website and I used these assets to sketch out some basic things like the game board, terrain, objectives. Not long after that, I found this free asset pack from Kanos on itch and I used it to enhance the visuals. And then I got started on the first phase of the game, the deployment phase. In Manafields, players deploy units from their army within their territory. And in this early version of the game, the idea had been that players would take turns dropping one unit at a time, but I would later end up changing this, and in the most current version of the rules, players deploy their entire army in secret, and only get to see their opponent's deployment once the game has begun. At first, I placed this obelisk asset from the Kanos pack in the center of the objectives. As I was working on this stuff, I was also playtesting the rules with friends on Tabletop Simulator, where I used a pillar in the center of the objectives in a similar way. I thought these were really great visual features. I thought they drew players' attention to the objectives really well. But it was around this time that we discovered some issues in playtesting. Firstly, the objectives were just way too large. In Manafields, you score points from objectives by having more units on them than your opponent. The idea is hopefully that players will fight on objectives to reduce their opponent's numbers and to maintain control. What was happening, however, was that the size of the objectives was just incentivizing players to pile their units up and to spend their turns outnumbering their opponent one unit at a time. Players weren't even engaging in combat until like 10 or 12 turns into the game, which was a massive problem. And although they looked quite cool, the pillars in the center ended up just giving players some extra protection from the enemy units on the other side. So my solution was to shrink the objectives and to remove the obstacles in the middle. Suddenly, units were dangerously close to enemies and the game was applying much more pressure on players to be the first to attack. Next, I started working on the dice roller for the game. After players have deployed their units onto the board, they each roll a dice, and the winner of the roll-off takes the first turn. I took inspiration for this dice roller from the one I use in Tabletop Simulator, where you spawn dice and then drop them into a portal to roll them. For a while, I even tried to create the same kind of dice gathering feature, but it was pretty glitchy, and I felt like it was a distraction. It's definitely something I'll come back to later on. With deployment and priority rolling complete, it was time to start working on the core loop of the game itself. In Manafields, players take turns issuing orders to their units with order points, and you get 3 order points on your turn. You can issue those order points all to the same unit, or you can spread them out, however you like. There are 5 types of orders in the game, but at this early stage in development, I was mostly focused on the 3 most basic ones: moving, fighting, and shooting. But before I got started on any of that, I decided I wanted some sprites to better reflect the units in the game. I found a pixel artist, Gandalf Hardcore, on Fiverr, and I asked him to make some sprites for the humans in the game. I really liked how they turned out. I threw them into Sprite, I got them animating, and then I put them in the game. At first I had them at their real size on the grid, but I found that the grid squares fully surrounding them made them feel like small and flat. So I took a look again at Wargroove and how their units overflow the grid spaces that they're standing on. I really liked this approach, so I sized my sprites up so that they appear to have some height over the grid itself. The first and most basic order that I started with was the move order. In Manafields, each unit has a different speed. This is the number of squares that they're allowed to move in a single move order. For most units, that speed is 3, and for cavalry, it's 4. Again, I looked at Advanced Wars and Wargroove and looked at the way that they highlighted legal move squares for their units. I especially liked how Wargroove also highlighted the squares that the unit would be eligible to fight on after they finished moving. Very simply, these are all the squares that a unit with move speed 3 is allowed to move onto in Manafields. But I knew it wasn't going to be as simple as just highlighting these squares. In Manafields, units can't move through other units and they can't move through terrain. So if a unit with move speed 3 is blocked by another unit or by terrain, their legal move squares actually look more like this. I needed a way to calculate these squares from scratch each time a player clicked on a unit. I needed a program that would ask for the unit's position on the grid and their move speed, and would then tell me which squares it was possible for a unit to reach. I did some research and found this article that had a bunch of interactive examples of pathfinding algorithms for games. And when I played around with this one, I realized it was exactly what I needed. The example here even had pieces of terrain for the algorithm to skip over. The algorithm is called flood fill or breadth first search. Basically, the idea is just that it pushes out in all directions at the same time until it finds the thing it's looking for. Using the steps in the article, I wrote a program that asked me for a unit's position and speed, and then created a version of the board in a text file that showed all of that unit's legal move squares. You can see here that the T's represent terrain, the X represents the unit, and the O's represent all of that unit's legal move squares. And it worked. The algorithm took terrain into account and stopped searching for legal squares in that direction once it found an obstacle like terrain or another unit. I knew this was also going to be perfect for determining the range of shooting units. I ported the algorithm over into the game and I started highlighting move squares. This was a really exciting step, and I had honestly expected it to be much harder than it ended up being. Pretty soon I implemented move orders, and players were able to click and drag units to move them onto new squares. Inspired by Wargame, I implemented legal square highlights in a different color for enemy units, so that players could click on enemies for information about their movement. I added some unit ownership highlights so you could tell which units were yours and which were your opponents, even if they all looked the same. And then I got started on combat. In Manafields, units can receive a fight order in order to attack enemy units in melee. Units can attack squares that are north, south, east or west from them. I added some combat highlights in a different color, and then I allowed the player to click on an enemy unit in range to target them. At this point I was sick of looking at the grey background behind the board, so I took some more assets from the Kanos pack and I used them to decorate the sides of the board in a more subdued palette that helped to place the battle in some narrative context. I have a few other maps in development, each of which will be in a different setting, such as the desert or the snow, but I'll show those off some more in a future video. I made some changes to my dice roller so that you could use it to roll attacks, and I also changed the way it looked so that it didn't take up the whole screen anymore, and it kind of kept the game in context behind it. I then added shooting orders and used the same algorithm that I used for the move order to highlight all legal squares for a shooting unit. So after about the first month of development, the game had its 3 most fundamental orders implemented and ready to go: moving, fighting, and shooting. After that, I took a look at the basic troops in the game: infantry, cavalry, and archers. Each of them has a unique rule that allows them to play a different role in the game, and I got to work implementing those. Infantry's special rule is that they are the only unit that's allowed to fight diagonally. What's so strong about this is that in Manafields, move orders cost 2 order points if you're adjacent to an enemy. So infantry can move diagonally adjacent to an enemy and start attacking them, but the enemy must spend 2 order points to shuffle up and a third to attack them in response. Archer's special rule is that the shoot order only costs 1 order point instead of 2 if they haven't moved earlier in the turn. I think this rule is really cool because it rewards players for setting up their shooting pieces in earlier turns. But if you really need to shoot at a target, you can spend 1 order point to move them and then 2 order points to shoot, which does give you some significant range. Lastly, the cavalry special rule is that they do damage on impact when they move in a straight line towards enemies. This is a really good way to get some guaranteed damage onto enemy units, and it gives cavalry a unique role on the battlefield that they were lacking in earlier versions of the game. So that's where we're at with Manafields. At the moment I'm working on adding the final few orders of the game: heroic abilities, the march order, and faction abilities. In my next video I'll have received sprites for the other 3 factions in the game, and I'll let you know all about who they are and how they change the playstyle of the game in unique and flavorful ways. So let me know what you think so far. I'm super excited about this project and I can't wait to get it in players' hands. See you in the next one.